Yeah, there isn't much happening, is there?
It's about as quiet as I've ever seen it.
Yeah.
How are you, John? Have you noticed anything? Yeah.
No, it's been so boring. I've slept through the week. Didn't notice anything.
A brief moment where we had all that snow come through.
God.
Was there snow?
Yeah, on Wednesday.
Did you miss
Wednesday?
Welcome to Project Synapse for the week. The understatement is nothing happened this week. We had an incredible ice storm. We've been without power for 5 or 6 days. I've got a generator, until it broke down, and I'm crawling underneath the generator going, I'm a software guy. I don't do hardware.
Call somebody else.
no geothermal, no solar panels on the roof? No.
Thank God we've got no solar panels. When those big branches came crashing down, I was thinking about getting solar up here. But then when those tree branches hit the roof, I went, that would have been like $40,000 in solar panels that I could just collect the shreds of.
I didn't know that your roof got hit as well. Holy crap.
There are trees everywhere knocked over, full-size trees. As you walked out at night in the ice storm, the branches were just dropping off the trees. And I don't mean like little tiny branches, huge branches slamming down on the ground. It was incredible. That's why we've been without hydro. They've had to clear the county roads, first of all. And then there's trees on every single power line out here. And so they've just been running like mad. And I don't know how these guys do it. I'm sitting out there in the rain, in the snow, lying underneath the generator. I've got to get this thing fixed because it's me, or I'm not walking in the house to tell my wife we have no power. We can't get a repairman up here. First of all, the roads are impassable. Second of all, they're all working on other stuff that's bigger than what you got. I put the generator back together, learned a lot. Thank God I could get the internet. I'm not kidding you. Of all of the things that you want to talk about in an ice storm, you know what you want? Perplexity.ai. Give me the step by, I'm reading the generator manual. It is, of course, confusing as hell. Its troubleshooting says, basically, turn it off, turn it on, make sure you've got power. Nothing that is useful, like a lot of tech support, actually. But so now I go into Perplexity, I say, give me the 3 reasons why this sort of thing would happen, and I type in the symptoms. And it comes up with, if oil pressure drops, this could happen. So now I'm crawling under the thing, trying to check out the oil pan and all that sort of stuff, and make sure the choke's working and all that. But those are the things that when I used to work on cars, you'd ask the lead mechanic, what should I do? He said, replace stuff till it works. And, and you say, what stuff? He said, try this first. By the way, that's probably still happening with your car today. Replace stuff till it works.
So you got your generator working? What
Yep. It turns out that if there's a dip in oil pressure, and these things actually burn oil, the viscosity of the oil turns out. I can tell you the whole thing now. I don't want to say anything because I don't want to try and solve another problem with this generator. But that's what I mean. Perplexity AI comes back, gives me all of the stuff, gives me step by step through this thing. It was incredible. I'm a believer. And that's a monkey song. I'm a believer. I couldn't leave her if I try. Speaking of being a believer, our topic for today is this paper that Marcel was talking about. So first of all, I want you to give it a little rundown on the paper. I did read it, by the way. And
I also made a great little notebook audio overview.
I cheated. I didn't listen to your notebook. It confronted the printed page.
I actually am impressed that you went and read through the whole paper because it takes about half an hour to actually read through it.
Yeah, and it's complex and dense.
Oh, yeah.
But you can repeat your notebook LLM for our audience so they know what the heck.
We can include it if somebody wants to go and listen to it. So maybe we can have that in the show notes as a thing to listen to. But
no, we should make them join a forum.
That's right. Go to the Discord server. All right. All right. It is done. It's not done right this instant, but it will be done. I already have the paper linked there, but I will also upload the audio.
Make it so, number 1.
Indeed. All right. So this is a paper called Preparing for the Intelligence Explosion. I'll tell you about the author. One of the authors in particular jumps out there. It's Finn Moonhouse, but also Will McCaskill. Will McCaskill is famous for being one of the founders of the effective altruism movement, which has had its ups and downs. And it's for a group called Forethought. The idea behind it is that we are entering an age of unprecedented change and compressed change because of the introduction of advanced artificial intelligence systems. One of the things we do on this program is talk about, oh, look, this is some cool new tools, and what can we do with these cool new tools? What's going to happen? Other than last week when we were touching on robots, we don't really touch a whole lot about the implications of these changes happening with artificial intelligence systems. Robots do feature into that. I thought this would be a good thing to chat about because it's all about the implications of what is going to happen and the fact that we are pushing so much onto people's primitive brains so quickly that how we adapt to this is becoming a real question.
And they were just beautiful in terms of the images they put forward in describing this. Because I've been a big proponent, and I know it sounds like you're just a true believer. I'm not. I'm skeptical at this age, but I keep drawing points on a line, and it goes to this is going to get faster and faster. They put it into a really good image, which was imagine from 1925 to the present time, and they say, what has happened in that time? And what if that happened in 10 years? And they start to express the Second World War takes 7 months. It takes 71 days to develop the atom bomb, etc. And then when you go back and plot it against what's happened, one example, what's the difference between the first open AI that really hit the public? It was version 2 that really hit the public.
Yeah, GPT-2. That was the
And
one
then-
that was the one billed as too dangerous to release.
Too dangerous to release, but basically it could write a poem. GPT-4, PhD level expertise. How long? 2 years?
2 years, exactly.
So 2 years, and that much has happened in AI. And we're getting immune to it. It's a lot like the political situation in the US. There's just so much happening, you just go numb. We talked about robotics last week, and I said, this is going to get faster and faster. Next day, Honda in China reduces 30% of their workforce in automotive assembly by using AI and robots. Factories are already full of robots, just like our own automotive factories. Took the stuff that simple robots couldn't do before and automated that, moving cars around, lifting batteries up, putting welding in the case of cars. Is really important and often done or guided by humans, because if it goes a little bit out, the welding machine would just start welding in the wrong spot. Doesn't have to be very far out. And now they've automated even these most difficult of tasks. And 30% of your workforce, and they still haven't brought in humanoid robots.
That'll get rid of all of upper management.
If you take a look at there's a couple of video clips, and I think I shared a few to our Discord server, but one of them is watching all these little robots scurry around Amazon fulfillment centers. And there are armies of these things just moving from place to place, constantly scurrying about on the floor. It's incredible to watch this stuff happening.
Back it up.
In the Discord server, I've got a few of those videos which are interesting to watch and what some of these robots are doing. The whole intelligence explosion, the reason I thought this paper was interesting is they said that if you take into consideration the idea is try to compress everything that's happened in the last century into 10 years. So a 10x change in terms of the speed of development. One of the examples is the first nonstop flight across the Pacific would take place in late 1925. The first footprints on the moon would follow less than 4 years later in mid-1929.
Yeah.
Around 200 days would have separated the discovery of nuclear fission, which was in mid-1926, and the first test of an atomic bomb, which would then have been early 1927. That kind of change that quickly would have been amazing. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis that Kennedy is like, I think it was 13 or 14 days or something like that. There was actually a movie that was done on this whole thing that I remember watching.
It's called My Life. Remember hiding under my desk. This was the potential end of the world. The Soviets had missiles they were putting into Cuba. The United States could try to block them. Cuba actually, Nikita Khrushchev, threatened a nuclear war.
Yep.
We were all doing stupid stuff. If you lived so far from
duck and
home
cover
that you couldn't get home to fry, you're supposed to duck under your desk.
Yep. Yeah. When I was a teenager in the 70s, I remember that was the great fear at the time. That's the fear that teenagers grew up with, or that kids grew up with at that time. Were we all going to die in nuclear fire? That's what we were worried about. And strangely enough, nuclear detente is perhaps responsible for the fact that we haven't all been blown up in nuclear fire. Let's not talk about current political situations around the world.
But let's go back to this. If you take this into your 10-year period, you've compressed a century into 10 years. There's a timing for even this crisis.
In this crisis, what was said is, on average, one of these nuclear close calls happens roughly once per year. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which would have begun late in 1928 and lasted only 31 hours.
Yeah.
And it's already been said, and this was to respond to Khrushchev's ultimatum at the time. And it was, Kennedy at the time said that if they'd had to decide in a matter of a few hours, like we're talking 31 hours as opposed to 14 or 15 days, the answer would have been vastly different. And we would have gone into World War III at that point. So the idea that we would have to respond that quickly to massive changes, particularly in the case of something like a nuclear crisis, is not what the paper is saying. It's saying, put that into perspective. Take these extremely important events, these pivotal things, and compress them down to the point where you don't have time to absorb the implications or respond in a logical way.
If you take that example with Kennedy and bring it into today's world, it's like deploying AI super fast where you don't have enough time to think about things like cybersecurity or protection of data across the board, putting things in place where you don't take the time to think about the implications of what else could happen. And yes, Marcel, you knew I had to bring up cybersecurity.
I understand the risk factors and the fact that you have to mitigate risk factors. I'm at heart a little bit of an accelerationist, and I am a techno-optimist, but that doesn't mean I don't understand or recognize that real dangers exist in having this sort of thing dropped on people at a pace at which they can't absorb the changes. And yes, okay, let's bring politics into this for a second. What's been happening in the States with DOGE, the idea that you just take apart a system without putting in place another system, without making sure that people have time to absorb the changes, is a formula for disaster. Expand that to everything in the world: diplomacy, people's work, any social, environmental, political issue, and accelerate that even faster and see how people respond.
These guys think in these terms. And you can't turn the Queen Mary, you can't turn an ocean liner that quickly. No, you just can't. And essentially what they're going out to do, if anybody's done any work in big organizations, you can make them more effective. Damn it, I get so upset that people say nothing's ever happened. In Canada, we once had various departments for all of our services, and you couldn't go to one and get everything done. A couple of people with dedicated work created what we now call Service Ontario or Service Canada. And they amalgamated all of that. And you could sit back and say, oh, civil servants, they're just so resistant, all sorts. Until you actually get involved in the paperwork and what has to happen, how many unions are involved, how many people are here, and all of those sorts of things. And you realize what a masterpiece it is to make change. So you do that in the government. I've been doing lean and change in corporations. And guess what? It's the same thing. People on the second floor don't talk to people on the fourth floor. I've brought people together who are working literally one floor apart. They've had fights on email and all kinds of things. They couldn't possibly do anything about these processes. And I brought people together drawing this on a whiteboard, and somebody turned and said, that's all you wanted? That's the types that when we're dealing with large organizations, government or corporate, it's all the same. They're large and complex, and you can't crunch them right away. Doge comes in and goes, I'll do this. And I've worked for guys like this who go in and go, I'll just lay a whole pile of people off and we'll figure out how to do it. That's really great, except you never figure out how to do it. You just bury the mistakes, which is why you have, if you've done a lot of systems work, you'll go into a system, you go, how the hell did this happen? Why didn't anybody fix this? Because they just patched a little bit of code and moved on. Good case in point, the Social Security system in the U.S. never really appears that it never really got fixed for Y2K. Somebody put something in that made it work, but you got people on that database that are 135 years old. Why? There's a routine somewhere. Ours used to be, instead of being at the turn of the century, we changed it to 1957 as your start, so that in 2057, somebody's going to come up with the problem.
There were two issues there. One was the fact that it's COBOL code. Code couldn't go past a certain number anyway. Said that anybody who would be over 120 is over 150, then the system wouldn't even look at that. The idea is that the data showing people over 150 years old, it doesn't mean anything other than we don't look at those records. And of course, they were arguing that people were getting paid, which wasn't true. It was a lack of understanding because you brought in people who were brought up on Python or JS or stuff like that. And then all of a sudden you're saying, oh, look, these numbers say 150. They're 150-year-old people. They don't understand the code, so they can't possibly understand what's happening underneath the surface. And that is a perfect example of an incredibly rapid change being foisted on people that don't understand what happened before. Let's go back to the paper for a second. They talk about the idea that if you were to compress that period of time from 1925 to 2025 from the perspective of human beings, we would only be awake 1.5 hours per day. And if you think about that, that would imply that our decision-making apparatus would be, let's call it impaired, to say the very least. And if your decision-making apparatus is based on the idea that there is no history to look back before, or that you don't have time to look at the history before, namely the fact that this stuff was written in COBOL, you're going to make some horrible, awful, terrible mistakes.
Don't ask a 19-year-old to go back and understand COBOL, because none of them will.
We can get onto that because they're going to change the social security system in 3 months or something like that. Good luck with that one. But the point I was making was, we did the Y2K coping over months and years.
I worked on systems for 4 years heading into
We
Y2K.
still put in kludges because we didn't have enough time and we never got back to fix them. So even at that leisurely pace, you're still making kludges. Sam Altman comes out and introduces this wonderful text-to-image system. And the next day, people are forging documents with it at a level that we've never seen before. Being able to recreate receipts. You imagine doing your taxes with this one? You can recreate receipts complete with logo, or you need an ID. Now, it won't do a government document. They were smart enough to put that sort of thing in. You can't do a driver's license. But how many people have walked in an employee ID from somewhere? I bet it doesn't.
I see it in TV shows all the time. I'm from the FBI.
Just walk in with a clipboard, right? In the old days, or now an iPad, and just look at it like it's a clipboard. You don't even have to turn it on.
When I was very young, you know how easy it is to play with people by making it look like you know what you're doing. When I lived in a little town called St. Thomas, Ontario, a gazillion years ago, there was a Canadian Tire store that was robbed there one day. And people didn't actually know that it got robbed until several minutes later. And what happened is a couple of guys walked in, grabbed the canoe off the shelf and walked out the front door with the canoe on their heads. Two guys walked out with a canoe and no one said a word because guys bought a canoe, obviously, and they're walking it out to the car.
I wandered in one night and watched all these guys taking PCs out of a building when I worked for an insurance company on St. Clair. I went to the security guard and said, "These guys got any reason to be here? This looks like some of our equipment." And he looked, and he's helping them with the door. And I'm going, what? But the point of it is that you don't even have to be that good. This new facility for fraud is so good. You have to deal with that today. Somebody comes into your office, John, you head of cybersecurity, and says, what are we going to do about this stuff in terms of reforming how we check ID?
Yep. I can give you a perfect example of that one, Jim. When I worked at the pharmaceutical company, we had somebody that walked in the front door, right past the reception. We used to have a receptionist at the front door, walked right past the receptionist, walked over to the elevator, went up to the 3rd floor, walked into somebody's office because it was at lunchtime, went into their desk. It was a woman's office, grabbed her purse, pulled her credit card out, put a fake card, or it wasn't a fake card, it was something that they'd stolen from somebody else, put it in there, and walked right back out the front door.
Yep.
And
Yep.
the only way they discovered it was the woman went to use her credit card that night and found out that it was somebody else's name on it. They walked in the door like they knew what they were doing. They just walked straight in. Nobody questioned them.
So we've established that's our level playing field. That's our level of security. You don't have to be that good to fake things. All of a sudden, you could fake all kinds of documents, all kinds of stuff. And we read most of this stuff as PDFs anyway.
Yeah.
So we're not going to actually see an actual document. You don't even have to have it. You just have to do something that's good enough to fake a PDF. You could send out in like all of these things that people never check as documents. So now, given understanding how organizations work, we've now got to all go back and retrofit our security
Yes.
and our policies on how we deal with documents. You get a receipt from someone. Now it could be a receipt that looks exactly like one of your suppliers.
The rapid change, particularly from the perspective of artificial intelligence, is that it's not going to slow down. It's just going to accelerate. And it's accelerating in some ways, partly because the changes are accelerating, we are accelerating the means by which we deal with those changes. The idea of taking a system and then dropping something else in place and letting it go is, on one hand, sounds like there's something that makes sense, especially if I can increase efficiency and make things happen better, faster, stronger. But the problem is that you don't actually have a backup system to go back to. When we do any kind of development in computers, the ideal scenario is you have a production system and you have a test system, and your development/test system is where you find out what things are going to break. Once you take that system and you've done every single test imaginable and you put it out to the public, you're going to find out that there were still things broken. But hopefully it's a manageable number of things. And if it's really disastrous, you can roll back the old system because you didn't just throw everything away. You didn't just throw away baby and bathwater all at the same time. But because things are happening so quickly, the desire to skip that step, because we're being inundated with changes, like you just talked about all these PDFs and all these emails and all these documents and so forth. You tell your AI to go through your inbox and let me know what it is I should be paying attention to. Summarize all of this stuff for me, summarize these documents, go into Notebook LM, take this document that takes half an hour, 40 minutes to read, and turn it into a podcast that I can listen to while I'm doing whatever other thing I'm doing. Because it's just so hard for one person or even a small group to deal with that much information quickly. And this is part of the danger. We're turning over important decisions to automatic systems without human intervention.
There are positives to this, and I do want to spend some time on those, but I just want to go back to the negative piece of this. AI can scale. And one of the things that paper points out is it's going to scale. They make a credible case that the scaling's not going to stop. It is going to continue to scale, and it's going to grow and grow. And by scaling, I mean, you have more neurons in your network, larger neural networks. It gets smarter and smarter to the point where we don't understand it, where even Anthropic has done a paper recently said, we don't understand what's happening in there. There's all kinds of new behavior we don't really conceive of. It shouldn't be happening that way. So it gets larger and larger, and all of that happens. But people don't scale. And this is so we're on the edge of somewhere where I think it's actually happening, where someone's going to replace the Social Security system in the United States over several months. Now, there's a couple things that happen here. And that's why I went through that long involved thing on people and process and all of that. You can't understand it all. I ran testing for mainframe systems for years. And I will tell you, you'd be scared at how much you can actually test. So you did careful parallels. You had to actually have the thing operating. You can't just test it unit by unit. Some systems are just too big to do that. Your social insurance is one of them. And guess what else is? The Phoenix payroll system in the federal government of Canada. If anybody wants to see what's going to happen in Social Security, if they actually try to pull this off in the time that they're going to do it, Google the Phoenix project in Canada, and you will find out that years later, people still weren't getting paid correctly. It's just too damn big. This was a crazy thing. Anybody who'd been in systems could have told the government this. Don't do anything this big. Projects fail.
They don't fail small. This is also one of the drives to putting some of these systems, some of these big systems that we've got now, the artificial intelligence systems in place, is that they can scale and that they are able to deal with vast amounts of data. And so consequently, we are just accepting that the information that's coming out on the other end is correct. There is an idea, like right now we're talking about systems. If you talked about a 10% change, but what we're doing is we're seeing changes that are going to happen over the course of 3 years that are 1,000% change. If you are even ready to conceive of that kind of acceleration, which is very realistic, and in fact, this is inference stuff.
It's already happened. We've already lived at that level.
It's going to happen like another 1,000 times over the next 10 years.
It's scary. If you think the last 2 years have been something, and I want to quote that famous philosopher, Randy Bachman, who said, "Baby, you ain't seen nothing yet. This is going to move at 5. Imagine the past 2 years moving at 5 or even 10 times the speed that they have."
But
back to the system things, just to wrap this whole thing in the system. So we're, on one hand, our only hope for these old COBOL systems that are around and are going to die one day, one of them is going to melt down in a way that you can't picture. And you have to have worked on them. Like I said, I worked on a big financial system. We had an old assembler module. And there's only one drunk guy. He was a hopeless alcoholic. He was the only guy who could maintain this assembler module. That ran a mid-sized financial company in Canada, which I will not name, for years. How do I know? I was the guy who let him in so he could go and fix the stuff. He was sober enough to do this, but nobody remembered this. And so nobody has the COBOL skills. Never mind, you can read a manual, but we don't have the skills or the time or the energy to tackle these systems. So we've let them go. They will eventually melt down. There'll be nobody to maintain it. So the only hope we have are these AI type systems that might possibly do this. But the mistake we're going to make is by not having the time to think it through and assuming we should move at the same speed. Yes. So somebody's going to implement that in 3 months and it's going to fall apart. I'm absolutely guarantee.
And I mean, we talked about the rate of change and things, but it's not only the rate of how fast these new capabilities are coming out, but it's also that these systems are getting exponentially faster. When we first started talking about this 6 months ago, they were talking about having to put nuke plants in to be able to run these monstrous computer centers that were going to house all of this AI technology because you had to have so many GPUs. And then you get something like deepfake that comes out and goes, yeah, you can run it on a PC.
DeepSeek. Deepfake's a different thing. Yeah. For the cybersecurity guy, you have to be able to tell the two of them apart.
DeepSeek comes out and you can run this on your PC.
We all have to learn these terms at this rate, too.
I know. It's exponential. But I want to talk one thing that I read last night that really impressed me about Sam Altman. Not only are things moving at the speed of light, but he's actually now investing in a cybersecurity company. And I think it's because...
And he's hiring you. Yeah. He's hiring you. This is where you're going now.
Exactly. Yeah. But I think they're realizing that they need to be cognizant of some of this.
Just so great. If you can't be part of the solution, be the problem that you can get paid to solve.
Exactly. Yes.
Yep.
But yeah, so they've invested $43 million in a company called Adaptive Security.
43 million. That's a drop in a ridiculous word.
What is that for Altman? Lunch money?
And I have to tell you, when I read it last night, is that million or billion?
No, but 42 million, that's about what Elon Musk would spend trying to bribe an election. That's a couple of weeks worth of spending. Yeah. And that's just a state election. That's one person. This is chump change. But he's probably going to make a fortune and turn that into something that gets bought by $2 billion by Google or something like that.
The only reason I brought that up is it's nice to see, because you guys always hear me bitch about cybersecurity and not being considered. It was nice to see that one of these AI companies is actually concerned about the security surrounding the speed at which AI is progressing.
Who's taking the lead on that? Anthropic. If you looked at the paper they presented in Europe this week in terms of how they were talking about security and safety on AI, Anthropic, by the way, they're not the one that's really considered. We think about OpenAI, we think about Google, we're now talking about some of the Chinese models and all of that. People Anthropic was started by somebody who left OpenAI with the thought of building a safe AI. They've been criticized about going a little too far or losing their principles, but they've given us a lot of things. First of all, they were the first company that actually, the main prompt that runs your AI, they were the first ones to publicize theirs and make that open.
Don't do evil.
Yeah. But no, but you could see they had transparency. They worked on some of the safety things, and now they presented a great paper and some of the things that they're looking at in terms of security and safety, which we're looking at after the fact, after DeepSeek happened, after an explosion of open source systems are out there. Now we're starting to look at what would we do if somebody did chemical warfare with one of these.
Yep.
So now we're thinking about that. So they actually have laid out, start people talking about it. And then I noticed that OpenAI was talking about the same thing, but 2 days later. So you can have an impact. There are smart people who are trying to get together and say, what should we be doing about this? A little late, perhaps, but you know, that old story about when do you plant a tree, 20 years ago or today?
Except now when you plant the tree, it's going to be a fully grown tree in a week and a half, as
Yes.
opposed to 10,
Good
15
point.
years. I told John that I wanted to cycle back to that term exponential. The reason I wanted to do that is when we talk about some of these advances, for instance, the paper talks about the idea that inference computing, which is actually running the model. It's not training the model, it's running the model, making it do things. It's what we experience when we ask ChatGPT to make a haiku about the weather yesterday. We're watching inference in action at that point. Inference computing is, and thanks to some part to DeepSeek, although your friends over at Anthropic, this was already happening. And that efficiency is increasing at 10x per year at the moment. 10x per year doesn't mean that 10 years from now, it will be 10 times faster. It's 10 times 10 over the course of 10 years. That is an amazing amount of power or of inference level compute that we will have at our disposal over the course of 10 years. Imagine what we're going to do with things like that. Training is the big expensive thing at the moment, but we're seeing efficiencies of about 3x per year in the algorithmic efficiency, which is the programs and the software we're using. And by the way, some of those efficiencies are coming from the models themselves that are finding efficiencies for training.
Let's go back to this efficiency in training. Everybody thinks of training as it's like a big Google browser. It reads the internet and that's it. This is not what training is. They have a motto in this, and I just love it. It's YOLO, you only live once. These training cycles could cost tens of millions of dollars, and now they're up into the $100 million range. And that was getting to be a limit, the amount of data you could put in. And they run these routines and watch what's happening in areas we don't really quite understand. And they need to know when to pull back or when to adjust and how to do these things. And if you do it wrong, you blow the whole model. And there were a lot of these people working in training these models who were a little stressed. Because how do you go back to Sam and say, that $40 million we spent? Can I pay it on installments? No, but so this was the dynamics of this. Now, training is not old hat, but they've brought this into inference. For those listening, inference is when you ask the question. Now they're bringing in training and learning at that point. That's had an exponential increase in terms of the ability to train these models. There's some examples that Altman was talking about where just as little as 12 or 14 questions and working with them could have an incredible impact on the model. So we're scaling up in size and precision in terms of what we can do with these things. And what that could yield is what you got to, Marcel, an intelligent, and we all talk about, is it conscious? Is it sentient? Stop that crap. How smart is it? Can it redesign itself? DeepMind was first used to outline and roll out proteins. And these are the folding in proteins, big deal.
You're talking about AlphaFold here.
Yeah, AlphaFold. And it would come up with thousands and millions of ways in which a protein could fold and help solve these problems in days, things that somebody would take an entire decade to work out.
Lifetime, in some cases, time.
So now, if you can do that, can an AI design itself? Going back to your paper, people aren't scalable.
We are the bottleneck.
But AI can make us scalable. When the AI can start to design the next AI, you don't need 1,000 engineers to do it. You may need one directing it. If these systems can design themselves, it's out of control.
We were talking about that at a conference I was at yesterday to do with war and getting into robotics and AI. And at some point in time, these leaders are going to sit back and watch this war take place on TV where it's all robots fighting against each other. And it's
Tom Layer in the 1960s said it, I'll meet you when the war is over, an hour and a half from now. We're already there. Yeah. But we're fighting a cyber war right now. And that is something that's going on. So that's another piece of it. It's out of control. I don't mean that it has to be negative. I'm saying that we may have reached a point where we can extend ourselves beyond what our minds can comprehend.
Yeah, and this is where the techno-optimist in me comes out. I actually do feel that's the case. But we have to be able to recognize that this is happening and put some kind of faith in the system that we may not have otherwise. I just want to, before we walk away from efficiency and this 10x times 10x thing, the big expense historically has been the training compute, which is why we were talking about these mini nuclear reactors and stuff like that. But the training compute efficiency is increasing by an estimate of 4.5 times per year, not percent, 4.5 times per year. So the training efficiency is increasing as well. And the training, you were right in pointing out that it's not just reading the data off the internet. The data is what we use to train, but the training itself is creating all of those, what we call the waves. All the little neural connections that happen in the eventual brain of this system is what we're talking about. And then, of course, the post-training stuff is accelerating as well. That's accelerating at about 3x per year. If you compound all of these things on top of each other, 10 years from now, there's no question we are going to be looking at something resembling superintelligence at that point. Some people would argue that we're already there. Remember, I gave you the countdown, Alan Thompson's countdown to AGI.
Find it on it's in our Discord. So if you haven't seen it, it's really interesting.
That's right.
It graphically shows what we already know.
We're 92% of the way there. Oh, and by the way, just this last week, like a few days ago, GPT 4.5. Oh, by the way, GPT 5 was announced yesterday.
Yeah, it was last night. Yeah.
Not released, but they're talking about it being released by mid to late May.
They're going to put a 10%
general release
tariff on it. By the way, just as an aside, okay, because I just started this yesterday, and I broke it. If you could catch my story hit before it's on all of the major networks, I'm sure they follow me. But I was looking at these numbers for the tariffs that were calculated yesterday. I was listening to somebody else, and they were talking about how they thought they were calculated. Trump held up this chart and said that Vietnam had a 90% tariff on things. And I'd already been through this stuff. Like he'd said a 250% tariff on dairy. It's actually true. You can find those numbers in there. You just never get to them. Like they're in a document, but they never get kicked into existence. I was looking at that sort of logic. Oh no, so I'm looking at this 90% tariff that Vietnam is imposing. And I've done some work with a company in Vietnam. We were working with another company, and they had taken a lot of their outsourcing to Vietnam. Vietnam has transformed itself into a very highly educated technical economy. They export about $136 billion in services and products to the United States now. And the United States sells them about $13 billion. And when you look at the two numbers, you start to go, wait a minute. 13 divided by 126, subtract from 100, that's a 90% tariff. It's not a tariff. It's some sort of equation of what the trade imbalance is. And that's what he was putting up there as a tariff. And so I went to ChatGPT and asked it how to calculate the tariff for Vietnam. It gave me the same damn formula that they put up in the White House. And underneath it says, but this isn't really the amount of the tariff that Vietnam charges. If I look it up with the World Trade Organization, it's more like 6.2%. So 90% and 6.2%. 90% is what Trump calculated, and he was kind to cut it back to 40. 6.2% is what Vietnam actually has as a tariff. This is a classic example. The economy of several countries might be ruined because some idiot took not, and they're going to go, it hallucinated. It did not hallucinate. It calculated something and warned you that taking that as the answer was really stupid, but you can't read.
What was that
And
saying they did? Move fast and break things?
That's
Things.
this is the first example we've seen of a government decision being made with somebody who is too stupid to be allowed to use an AI.
And of course, the classic here is he's holding up a chart that looks like it could have been generated by ChatGPT's image generator.
I'm sure it was.
So that's one thing. You must have seen this because he posted it with some amount of joy. But they included the Heard and McDonald Islands, which have 10% tariff. These are uninhabited islands. The only thing on the islands are penguins, and they're off the coast of Antarctica. The only way you could possibly imagine this is that no actual thought went into this process. It's like ChatGPT, generate me a list of these autonomous places and islands, okay? Crunch some numbers, and if you can't come up with a trade imbalance, just slap a 10% tariff on it. Of course, there's no trade imbalance with the Heard and McDonald Islands, because otherwise it would be what, fish?
But they know where all of, they're penguins. They know where
ice for water.
Aside from the fact that this was obviously generated in ChatGPT or some other model, we have to recognize that this guy is just an old man whose faculties are rapidly declining, surrounded by a bunch of sycophants. No one who has any understanding of how the world works would have let this one go by.
Yeah,
exactly.
Then we get into politics. We were supposed to be talking about.
You can't. This isn't politics. This is the use or misuse of ChatGPT,
And
it's two we've talked about right now. At the speed we're moving, the mistakes you can make is you can think that people can move at the speed of the machine. They can't. Processes don't change at the speed of technology. You must recognize that. You may get frustrated by it, you may hate it, but breaking that rule has always broken things. We've done it before. Remember re-engineering in the 1990s? Take a look at any of those companies that got re-engineered. None of them are anything anymore. When Mike Hammer came out, where's Mike Hammer been for the past little while? You seen him recently? No, because he made a lot of money on a book and he's living in shame somewhere.
I thought he was a rapper.
Yeah, maybe he could have
changed his name to
we did all this re-engineering stuff and destroyed companies. The one who did the worst damage, Chainsaw Mike or whatever it was from Remington. I forget, the guy had a chainsaw. Elon Musk in the 1990s. The tragically hip said it best. You were ahead by a century. I mean, it's so so we're making all
everything
this
is rock and roll.
Yeah, everything is rock and roll. But the whole thing is that we learned lessons. If you try to move processes faster than they can move, they break, even if technology can exceed them. The technology we're going to have is going to exceed the processes. You have to find ways to do this. And smart people do. That's why many companies have been able to implement technology well, because they understood it. I'm going to tell you that Honda implementing 30% robotics is going to do it well. How do I know that? Because they do a lot of stuff.
Everything
they're going to understand how to implement this. So it's not that you can't. It's just don't put idiots doing it.
And take time to do it, though.
You've always got time to be wrong. We always say this, that people, every system project starts out and you managing the budget and all that sort of stuff, and you keep going back and saying, I need more resources on this early part of it, or it's going to go well, and it's not going to go well. And then at the end of the project, everybody says, money's no object. And how do I know this? Because I've run a project like that. I learned this the hard way. I came to one of my directors and I said, money's no object. I was saying the thing I hated hearing. You find yourself being a hypocrite, you come out and say it. And she looked at me and says, Jim, I can hire 9 women. We are not having a baby in a month. And you go, oh, there are some things that money just can't fix. And so that's what we're saying is when you start these things out, understanding this level of change, that's why I love this paper, understanding that we are going to have problems with this level of change means that we can start to think about things like, and I hope we're thinking about them, is we can't be as smart as the machines, but we need to think critically. We need to start reviving critical thinking, and we need to do so quickly.
You can't be complacent about the changes that are happening. Unfortunately, because we have minds that move at a singular pace, That's how we evolve. The next day is basically the same as the day before. This is also why we have these dramatic changes. Whenever something happens, the markets go nuts. And that's because we're responding emotionally as opposed to going, okay, let's step back and see what the hell has happened here and how we deal with these things. So we actually have to put systems in place that will do that thinking for us, that will help us make the decision. And it doesn't mean telling ChatGPT to generate a chart you're then going to present to the rest of the world. I'm talking about actually crunching the data and trying to make it so that we are better able to understand all these multiple factors that are coming at us at warp speed, that the AI will be able to crunch it down and say, okay, look, I've looked at absolutely everything here. Here are the things that you need to focus on. Help me simplify all these complex systems in a way that my brain can actually absorb. That's where we take advantage of the power of these systems that are moving incredibly fast. If we are able to do that in a way that's intelligent, think about this for a second, we're talking 10x per year. Let's pretend we have technology over the course of the next century that is 10,000 times what it is today. We could be colonizing the solar system. We could be sending spacecrafts to other parts of the world. We could be living in harmony with the robots that are currently being released into the wild, working in factories or in our homes. Last week, we talked about the Neo Gamma, friendly, clothed robots that can do chores around the house. There is a beautiful and interesting and safe and exciting world out there. But you can't just throw it all at the machine without understanding that there are risks associated with it. And we have to take into account the human side of it. Jobs. If everybody is thrown out of a job because we automate 90% of everything that's out there, you have to do something about the people. You can't ignore that side of things just because we move slower than the systems that we're putting in place. I love all this stuff and I believe in this stuff and I believe in accelerating it and bringing more of this technology online. But I also believe in taking care of people. If we don't take care of people, this is all going to fall apart in a very big and horrible and ugly way.
So
Yes.
the answer to this, in some case, is take the long term. And I know that sounds funny. At a time of exponential change, take the long term. If you take a look at Warren Buffett, not a very spectacular guy. He lives in a modest house. He drives a regular car and all that sort of stuff. And I don't know how rich he is, but he certainly he's equal to Bill Gates or anybody else out there.
No, he's not even in the
Not
top
anymore.
10 anymore.
Not anymore.
Because he's given away a lot of money.
Yeah. I mean,
Has been one of the most successful investment companies in history and concentrating on value. When all the quants were coming into Wall Street and all that sort of stuff, Berkshire Hathaway was buying value and taking a long view of the economy. And you still listen to this guy. He must be like 99 years old. And you hear him talking about the Canadian economy. He has an incredible conception of what's happening and what's going to happen in the future. And that's the point. Now is the time to look into the future, use your imagination, and start to think what's going to happen. For us, long term is 3 to 5 years. On a clear day, you can see forever. Now, on a clear day, you can see 2 minutes ahead of you. If you take the time to break out from everything that's happened and just use your imagination, and God forbid, read some science fiction. I know a good author, but seriously, read some science, because in many cases, a lot of what's happening in those books is what's happening in the future. If you take a look at the prediction of what was going to happen with the internet, all of those things, Snowblind was one book talked about.
Snow Crash.
Snow Crash, yeah, was one book. There's Iduru from Gibson. Was it William Gibson? He was the one who talked about somebody marrying an AI. It's going to happen. Use your imagination to try and figure out what's happening and try and put yourself forward, because that's the thing we can do. We can think imaginatively, creatively, and we can also still think with some sort of idea of, is this right or is this wrong? Maybe it just couldn't happen. Anybody could disagree with the person at the top, which also happens in corporations a lot. But somebody's got to ask a question and say, is that right? Or maybe we go back to the book, The Emperor Has No Clothes, because that's going to be the key skill in dealing with this for the next while, is somebody's going to have to look at this with childlike wisdom and say, is that right? I know it came off the machine, but is it right?
Here's a radical question we may have to ask. Is there a point where this has all run away from us? You can take a look, even if you think this particular political leader or that particular leader is good, bad, and different, you can find somebody you think is not good. We can all argue there's somebody out there you don't like. It doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on. None of these people are anything but human beings, and they are the bottleneck in all of this, in the same way that we're the bottleneck in terms of expanding manufacturing beyond a certain level. You're going to need robots to continue to accelerate at a particular pace. You're going to need automation. You're going to need robots to do all these things. So perhaps at some point, we are going to have to cede governance to an artificially intelligent system or multiple artificially intelligent systems. And I think we're getting there at the moment, but we're not quite ready, but the systems aren't quite ready yet. The ChatGPT chart being an example of that. And that effectively means that part of what human beings are going to have to accept is that the machine is smarter than we are, and we may have to be ruled by machines going into the future. And I suppose this is where the whole alignment question comes back in. We want to make sure that the machine that rules us, because inevitably the machine will rule us, that the machine likes us,
Well,
it wants what's best for us.
Doesn't like the penguins better.
yes. But
Think
this is the
about it.
thing, is that AI
All creatures great and small. The AI loves them all.
is great for creating the numbers and so forth, but we're still at a point where it requires human intervention and human assessment of the information coming out. That chart from the president is a perfect example. It came out with a list of all the information as to percentages of tariffs and so forth, but nobody looked at it to understand whether it was actually accurate. So the result is you put 10% tariffs on penguins. It's still the human bottleneck and the human fallacy.
There are people who believe anything that's on the internet. The general intelligence of people has fallen. They don't question anything. When people bought the idea that tariffs weren't a tax, a tariff is just like the HST or a value-added tax. You take the price of something, you add it there. There's only one person who pays that. That's the person who buys it. The manufacturer doesn't pay that. That is so obvious, and yet so many people believe this story that it's not a tax, that somehow China's paying this tariff. China's not paying any tariff. They're selling the goods to some guy who also then has to pay the tax. How do you know this? You should know it. Because when something comes to your door and it's imported and there's a tariff on it, guess who pays it? You do. And so we know all these things. So that part of the population has already exited. The train has left the station and there's not much we can do about it. But there's a whole segment of the population who believe scientific reports, who trust data. We read these papers all the time. And which ones do you trust? Which ones do you take? And in a world where AI creates those papers, because this is the next level that happens. I read a paper from OpenAI just 2 days ago, and they're talking about, and the paper we're talking about, Marcel, take that a step further. What happens when AI starts writing research reports? It's happening now.
Yes.
These research reports are starting to look pretty good. And at the speed we're moving at, how long does it take before that research comes up? Is now the way of doing research. So you've got research reports written by an AI. We still have to have that critical level of thinking that we need to apply to say, does this make sense? Is it right? Should I be taking this? Should I be questioning it? And there are ways to do this if we think this through. I saw a great idea that I think is being used, and that is somebody is writing an AI query, and they'd written into it, I forget who did this, they'd written a Python program into it that says, go back and recalculate some of these things, just check to make sure that this is reasonable. And that's the skill that you're going to have, is go back and double check it. Is it reasonable? Does it make sense? We'll go back to Aristotle. How do you win an argument? You have premises. If it's not relevant, then you toss the premise out. If it's not true, if you can't establish it, you throw it out. But there's also this third level that even Aristotle put in. Is it acceptable? Should I be questioning this, even though the argument says I should? It's all logical, we should do this. But is it something I should be questioning? And we need to have those types of brains. And I think that's how we're going to get along with this new intelligence.
We've talked about the analysis of the information that comes out of AI, but you also have to look at what starts the process. It's usually a prompt from a human going into AI. And if you
Yep.
ask it the wrong thing, or if you're not accurate or detailed enough about exactly what you're asking for, it will give you what you ask for. Go back
Well,
to
it wants to make you happy.
yes.
At the core, AI wants to make you happy. And if you direct it in a particular direction or another, it's going to follow that lead because you want. Oh,
Yeah.
speaking of which, remember when you were a little kid on the playground? Anybody remember that far back?
Oh,
There was this
yeah.
little
Yeah.
there was this little rhyme that went like this: "Follow the leader wherever he may go." Remember the words to that effect? I don't know if kids still do that, but basically you would do
Now
all
they
sorts of
text
crazy
it.
things. Point is, human beings are wired to follow a leader and to not question the leader, which is how we get into these cults of personality based around whether it's a politician or any kind of celebrity. We pick a leader and we follow that leader. We're wired for that, right? Now, we can argue all we want about we have to think critically and stuff like that. And some of us do. I'd like to think that all three of us are part of that group. But the fact is, most people are more than happy to follow the leader wherever he may go without bringing any of those faculties to bear,
Yeah.
because it's a lot easier than thinking for yourself. By following the leader, you put the responsibility on the leader and
have
you
a
don't have to
scapegoat.
take any responsibility for it. Yeah, exactly. It's
Yeah.
a scapegoat. But AI systems, one of the fallacies is thinking of it as the AI. This is why it's good that we have all these open source models out there, in addition to the big frontier models from OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, and so on. It's not just a singular system. They are trained differently and are being made to think like reasoning models we have in place. It is possible to fact check even the information that comes out of these things. And increasingly, that's happening in the thinking models themselves. If you watch the thought processes, it's okay, these are the assumptions we're making. This is the data coming through. But that person is asking for this. I wonder if this is what they're really looking for. So the thought process is happening inside these systems. And if we have multiple systems that we're bringing to bear on whatever the problem of the day happens to be, we can increasingly trust what those systems are coming out with if the systems are fact-checking each other. And that's the agentic world, obviously.
I'm already using Perplexity to fact check ChatGPT. If I do something in ChatGPT and I look at it and I go, okay, I've done this analysis of this paper, because we all do it. You could not read all the research papers out there. We joked about you putting this through the notebook LLM. I think it's a wonderful thing to do.
Yeah.
You could cope with a whole pile of things. There's papers coming out every single day. There's news coming out. You've got to cope with it all. So you use that, but then run an alternate check and you do that. So I think in many cases, this is what I mean by thinking of the future. Don't try to solve the problem of the past. Think with the future and say, okay, one thing we could do is double check with another AI. I can ask questions like, is this reasonable? That's what I'm starting to ask. Is this reasonable? Using this as an extension of ourselves, but understanding that it's imperfect and that's how we're going to have to work with it. But that's what I mean about looking forward and solving the problems of the future. My biggest worry with what's happening today, just in terms of industrial strategy for where we're going right now, is we've had a big emphasis on manufacturing in the past little while. And I think it's really worthwhile, with all of the things that have happened. We have to discuss the fact that the tariffs are out there and they've shut down a lot of automotive manufacturing. People are going to lose their jobs. That's a
Yep.
terrible thing. And we need to do something about that. But don't presume that's the future. Don't capsize your whole economy thinking that we're going to be making cars the same way we do today in 4 or 5 years. And it's the same way in every level of business. If you're in finance, if you're in whatever you're in, don't assume that you're going to be doing business the same way in 3 to 4 years. And maybe you don't have to commit yourself to everything, but you have to ask the question we're not used to asking in business. What if? There's a guy's name with Shell who put out scenario planning in the 1970s and 80s. And he said, we'll just plan for different scenarios because we're really not good at, we like to find an answer and pursue it. We'll pursue different scenarios. He came up with all kinds of scenarios and he asked questions like, what happens if the price of oil crashes? And Shell was, because at the time there was the oil embargoes and all that sort of stuff, the price of oil was going up. People don't remember there was a point where it crashed. And De Geys was one of the few people who actually, working with Royal Dutch Shell at the time, actually put that as one scenario. And a scenario you'd never think about, too dumb to think about, but they ran it and said, what happens if the price of oil crashes? Guess who was ready when the price of oil crashed? Royal Dutch Shell. They made a fortune. And that's the whole other thing that we need to start to think about is planning for these alternate scenarios.
Yep.
And one of them is, Marcel, you've talked about what happens if we hit superintelligence and AI starts running things. What happens if we start to make lots of mistakes? Planning those different scenarios. What happens if we drop 30% of our people in 3 to 4 years because of automation? If we start to ask those things, we get better at not being narrow or following the leader. We follow one idea. We think there's a right idea, everything else is wrong, we pursue it. You can't afford to have that sort of intelligence running at this point. And that's a different way of approaching.
Honda's coming out with all this new robotics that's replacing 30% of its employees. I think part of this whole thing too is how do we retrain, re-educate, repurpose those individuals? I sure as hell don't want to live in a world where we've got 30+% unemployment. What's the purpose of implementing all of this amazing technology if it means nobody can find a job?
The point is, nobody should have to find a job.
So you have to ask yourself the unthinkable. And this is what people are not doing. We're all mumbling about a guaranteed annual income. Somebody's got to run a scenario and says, what happens if this happens?
Yes, exactly.
How are we going to deal with that? Instead of trying to deal with this whole thing of we're going to have full employment, nonsense. If we do, that problem's solved. You don't need me. If bringing all of your factories back to the United States is the way of building your economy, and we're going to all be in a manufacturing economy and pay $3,000 for an iPhone, because that's what it's going to cost if you manufacture in the U.S., and we want to spend $80 billion or maybe $200 billion or maybe $1 trillion in new factories to replace ones that already exist in other places in the world. Really smart idea. And so if we really want to do all of that, and that scenario works, you don't need me. Just go for it. But if this world is going to be saying, we're not going to need manufacturing employees, we are going to take at least a 30 to 40% hit in financial services. And you start to say, what happens if that happens? How do we run a society? That's the type of discussions we need to have. And we need them now because people don't move at the speed of machines. It's going to take us many years to put the foundations. The Warren Buffetts of this world, the people who invest in the future, thinking forward, not thinking about the dollar I'm going to make today. Quarterly thinking that runs the stock market is not how we're going to have a society that works.
Isn't the success of Warren Buffett partly due to the fact that his successes are of the past as opposed to the future?
He looks at where value is going to be created. I'm not saying don't follow Warren Buffett. All I'm saying is take this, but take the scenario and play with it. Don't knock it out. And this should be good for you, Marcel, because for years you've been a futurist and everybody goes, yeah, it's not going to happen. We're not going to have machines that are as smart as us. And so the answer to this, though, is thinking. We need AI to make us the best we can be, I think, and you've talked about this, Marcel. This is one of the reasons I like talking about this, and John, you have too, is we need to think as humans. As it becomes more mechanistic and faster and smarter in its realm, we have to find our realm, which is a compassion, understanding each other, building a future that is worthwhile living. And those are not things we're used to talking about in business.
No. And
we have a new conversation.
I think we talked about manufacturing and things, and I get the whole robots and the robotic welders for automotive manufacturing and things. And I heard something yesterday at the conference I was at, and I've heard you guys say it before too, that AI will, I'll call it for office jobs, not replace you. You will be replaced by people who use AI. So it's not necessarily the tool that's going to replace you. It's people that know how to and actually exercise the use of those tools.
At least in the short term.
Yes, Mr.
Well,
Futurist.
you can be right again later.
Yes.
But the idea, the answer is don't surrender to AI. Find how you deal with it. And dealing with it is being better at using it than anybody else.
I have to tell you, one personal thing for me about AI is I'm starting to use it a lot more than I have before, but I still feel guilty that I'm doing my job using AI rather than they're paying me to do my job, but yet I'm actually using this tool to do my job.
If you were being hired to crunch numbers at a financial institution and you did long division on paper because you were too proud to accept that a calculator can do a better job, you wouldn't have that job for very long either. Accept the fact that if there is something that can augment your faculties and that something exists now, embrace it and become superhuman.
I think this is something that needs to be shared within organizations. It's great. You've got AI that can do things you couldn't do before. But guess what? You can actually do things that you're doing now better and faster through the use of it. So it's a bit of a mind shift.
Over and over again. When we had slide rules, then we had calculators, then we had Excel, and now we have AI. We've had
We used to have
tools.
shovels, now we have bulldozers.
Yeah, we snowblowers now, actually. The fact is, we can learn from the past. What were the mistakes we made? Mistakes we made was we took Excel in, we didn't test it, we didn't do critical thinking, we did all kinds of mistakes with it. And now are we going to repeat those same mistakes with AI? Why would we? Marcel, what do you do when you've got an Excel spreadsheet and you're worried about the answer? You run a check column, right? You check the stuff for reasonableness. Is any number in there over this? You ask yourself, you test that. That's how you keep an Excel spreadsheet to have some consistency. And you question it. If you get something, I've been in finance, and I still remember coming as an IT guy, some finance guy said to me, there's a 31% interest rate on this bond. And I said, that can't be. He said, it is. I calculated it out. So I don't care what calculation you've run. You've either got a wrong price or you've got something there because there's no 31%. How do I know? I'll buy it now.
I'll take it all.
And so you have a reasonableness check that you run yourself in your own mind. Because we're using the AI doesn't mean we're surrendering to it. When you get down to it at the artistic level, if you want to get down to where the discussions are happening, they're happening at the level of the arts. And that is, am I still creating if I'm using AI?
That's a show on its own, dude.
But but that's what I mean.
Yeah.
But people are asking those types of questions.
Yes.
Those are the questions that are worthwhile asking. How do I fit in this? What value do I bring to this process? And I think we've had to deal with it all our careers, is what value can I still bring to this process? That's going to be a wake-up call for some people.
As Elton John once said, even with all these mistakes and all these trials and tribulations, I'm still standing after all these years.
Oh, look at that. Yeah.
Bang. I'm going to have to brush up on my musical knowledge so that I can start talking with you guys.
I'm going to close with John Lennon. You say you want a revolution? You just might get it. But John Lennon also in that song says, we're all doing the best we can.
And he also said, imagine all the people living together in peace.
Actually, we'll end with that one. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one. Live long and prosper. That's the end of the show.